The Uruk-Mizino spin-off series has officially introduced us to Pentamonym. We already knew who Pentamonym was, it's what made the reveal so exciting, and we also saw some sneak peeks in season 1 here and there, heard about him, all that stuff, but we never knew the full picture. We only heard some things here and there from Han Sung-yu or Yuri. We only knew some things from the blog posts, but now in chapter 1 of Uruk-Mizino, we get a full, detailed breakdown on where Pentamonym came from, what his goals are, what he chose to do, and where he might be currently. Now, of course, we'll make a whole video on Pentamonym as we have in the past with all of this updated lore information, but today I want to hone in on the most important part of Pentamonym's character. The fact that he is the only known axis in Tower of God. But what is an axis? I got a lot of these comments on my previous video talking about the recent lore from the Uruk-Mizino spin-off series, and so I wanted to break it down. Now, automatically, I know a lot of you, a number of you, are probably typing in the comments and saying, well, Pentamonym's not an axis anymore, right? The axis lore has been retconned. You might be right. However, we do have some evidence that it might not be. I was recently at Anime Expo 2025 and CU was there and did a bunch of signings. We made a whole video about it. You can definitely check it out. And one of the questions that a fan asked CU, providing video proof as well, is whether or not Pentamonym is still considered an axis. And according to the video and according to the Redditor, the fan, CU said yes. Shout out to Towns DL for asking CU this question. If I had the chance to ask CU a question, I would have asked if Chang was still dead or not. But ultimately, we don't know if this still means, like, maybe he is still an axis, but maybe the term axis has like changed meanings. But either way, like the fact that CU like seemingly so enthusiastically like agreed, like, no, he's still an axis, like is interesting to me. And I want to assume until proven otherwise that this axis lore could still be a part of the Tower of God lore, the Talse Uzer Story lore, and Pentamonym's lore. But what even is an axis? Well, simply put, an axis is a creator of the world? Of the universe? Pretty simply put, right? Yeah, okay, pack it up. The video's over, let's go. If you don't know, Tower of God is one of the stories in what is called the Talse Uzer Story, which is kind of CU's playground of stories that he can write within. If you don't know, Tower of God wasn't CU's first story. He actually had a number of stories that he had written before, and he considered all of them to be a part of the Talse Uzer Story. Most of them have been removed from the internet, aside from a few panels that were saved here and there, but for the most part, Tower of God came along and then became the center point of the Talse Uzer Story, but certainly not the only thing. Certainly not the only story. So there's this entire universe of stories that kind of exist separately from each other, that are intentionally left completely apart from one another. They're not connected in any way whatsoever. The only thing that they share is that they are sort of managed, or their stories are set into place by axes. Another word for axis that is completely valid could be God, but I think a better word would be that they are the authors of the entire Talse Uzer Story universe. They are described as having abilities and powers, not so much like combative powers, but powers to dictate the story's outcomes. Essentially not being able to go into the past and not being able to really necessarily like change the future even, but like set a story into motion that has limited outcomes. There's no infinite possibility once you set that story into motion. And then once you set it into motion, like the future is basically almost guaranteed. Like the author like sets a story into motion and then it just keeps going on. Like it breathes life into a story idea essentially. And the only known axis would be Pentamonym, who is obviously connected to the Tower of God lore, as we see with Uruk and with Pentamonym destroying Jihad's armed forces and entering his castle and slaughtering everybody and such. So Pentamonym is assumedly, perhaps even, the axis or author of Tower of God. Perhaps you could even say the god of Tower of God. Now, people have speculated, myself included, that the outside god who resurrects Bomb could be another Axis, some kind of being on the outside with this ability. But with the Shining Ones lore, with the Uric spinoff, it puts it into a weird perspective and a weird place where we have to kind of figure out like Shining Ones and the ones who swallow the light, the followers of Pentaminem, and Axes, like who is what and who falls into which category. So we gotta try to stay on track with just what we know an Axis to be. We'll save all the theories and speculation for later. I find the term Axis very interesting because obviously CU is using it in this kind of context of authorship and kind of helping manage and create stories in the universe. But the term Axis is actually one of like the broadest terms ever. I think it applies most commonly in like mathematics, like creating a line and like a spectrum on a graph. I'm not a math major, bear with me on this one, but it could also apply to politics. You see it used a lot with that kind of like creating like political spectrums and such, and like kind of putting people into different categories. But you can also use it in terms of science, like various creatures' anatomy has to do with the term Axis as well. And even technology, and even according to Wikipedia, the video game Yellow Undertale Yellow. So that's cool. Shout out Axis, Alabama, we see you. With all that in mind, like these Axes are canonically like the most influential beings in the entire universe. They dictate the future, and it's not some kind of giving you the freedom once you're inside. Like their stories are set in stone, that they are basically unchanging, and their power is so great. I know I said not really combative, but to a degree that a non-Axis cannot, even the weakest Axis cannot be touched by a non-Axis, the strongest non-Axis ever. They exist, you know, we like to compare Rancor and Regular, but Axis and non-Axis are truly in completely separate categories. Now, what's kind of interesting is we use the term Axis to just like refer to people like Pentaminem, but technically speaking, they are Axis users. So this power of Axis is what kind of influences stories, and Axis users are like Pentaminem, who have the ability to use Axes. It's kind of weird. We just kind of bunch them together into one category because it's essentially the same thing. But what I found so fascinating is if you dive into deep Talse Uzer Story lore, like previous stories done by CU, apparently you are not born an Axis. Becoming an Axis user, utilizing Axis powers, is something you can awaken to. And this was a big part of a lot of the stories CU used to create. Like there are entire civilizations that were built around the idea of looking forward to this awakening. Like this is way beyond Tower of God. This is like, these are people and powers and beings that are so completely separate from the world that we're used to, even considering like irregulars, people from the outside. This is on an entirely different level. This is the power to create what are essentially entire worlds and universes. So an Axis has the power to influence and manage and create stories. The space around them is entirely unaffected by anyone that's not an Axis. They can set records into stone. They are truly the gods of not Tower of God, but the Talse Uzer Story, which we will be talking about in what is, I'm considering, a sequel video to this one. What I described is most of what we know about being an Axis, but there is some additional lore in the concept of what the Talse Uzer Story even is. So look forward to our next lore video where we break down the Talse Uzer Story itself, where I'll probably be bringing up some additional details about being an Axis. But if you just wanted like the bare bones, like not bare bones, but the summary and the main points, the major points about what an Axis is, then I hope this was helpful. Otherwise, look forward to the sequel video where we dive even deeper into being an Axis, the Talse Uzer Story, and some of the lore bits that we know from CU's previous stories, some of which are kind of wild. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you've been enjoying the Tower of God content lately here on the channel. I want to give a shout out to all of my Patreon supporters over on Patreon, especially our rankers. We have Louis Quijada, Mr. Nexo, Olaf Lind, Smap the Slayer Anime, Soren Quasagrok, and Tony Reed. Thank you so much for your support, and to everybody who watches and supports this channel. All right, I'll see you in the next video. Peace.